The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla stepped out of the royal car, her emerald green coat catching the light beautifully. The crisp October air carried the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of crowds gathering for the ceremonial changing of the guard. She had attended hundreds of these events over the years, but today felt different somehow. There was an electricity in the air that she couldn't quite place. As she walked toward the designated viewing area, Camilla noticed the unusually large crowd that had gathered. Tourists with cameras, local families with children perched on shoulders, and royal enthusiasts who had traveled from across the country all pressed against the barriers, their faces bright with anticipation. The Queen Consort smiled and waved graciously, her years of experience making these interactions feel natural and warm. "Your Majesty," called out a young girl from behind the rope barriers, "you look beautiful today." Camilla's heart warmed at the innocent compliment, and she made her way over to speak with the child and her parents. These moments of genuine connection with the public had become some of her most treasured experiences since joining the royal family. The ceremonial preparations were already underway. The Coldstream Guards, resplendent in their iconic red tunics and towering bearskin hats, stood at perfect attention. Their polished buttons gleamed in the morning light, and their white gloves were pristine against the dark metal of their rifles. The precision and discipline of these soldiers never failed to impress Camilla, and she felt a deep respect for their dedication to duty and service. Captain James Morrison, the officer in charge of today's ceremony, conducted his final inspection of the troops. His experienced eye caught every detail, the alignment of buttons, the angle of each bearskin hat, the polish on every boot. These men represented centuries of British military tradition, and he took his responsibilities seriously. The ceremony they were about to perform had remained virtually unchanged for generations, a living link to the nation's proud history. Among the guards stood Private William Hayes, a young man of 23 who had joined the regiment just 2 years earlier. Unlike his fellow soldiers, William's mind was not entirely focused on the ceremony ahead. Hidden beneath the formal exterior of his uniform, his heart carried a weight that had been growing heavier with each passing day. The night before, he had received news that would change everything he thought he knew about his life. William's grandmother, Mary Hayes, had been his anchor throughout his childhood. When his parents divorced when he was 8 years old, it was his grandmother who provided the stability and love he needed. She taught him about honor, duty, and the importance of serving something greater than oneself. It was her stories about her late husband's service in the military that had inspired William to join the Guards in the first place. The previous evening, William had visited his grandmother in the hospital where she was receiving treatment for pneumonia. What he thought would be a routine visit to check on her recovery became something much more profound. As Mary lay in her hospital bed, looking frilier than William had ever seen her, she had taken his hand and told him a story that shattered everything he believed about his family's history. "William, my dear boy," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you before it's too late. Something about your grandfather that I've kept hidden for 60 years. Her eyes, though tired, held a clarity that demanded his full attention. Mary had then revealed that his grandfather, the man William had idolized his entire life, had not died heroically in service as he had always been told. Instead, he had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged from the military for desertion during a critical mission. The shame of this secret had haunted Mary for decades, and she had created an elaborate fiction to protect William and his father from the truth. He was young and scared, Mary had explained, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The war was terrible, and he made a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. But I loved him, and I couldn't bear for you to think less of him or of our family's honor." William had sat in stunned silence as the foundation of his identity crumbled around him. Everything he had built his life upon, his sense of family pride, his decision to join the military, his understanding of honor and duty, suddenly felt like it was built on lies. The uniform he wore with such pride now felt heavy and foreign against his skin. As he stood in formation this morning, waiting for the ceremony to begin, William's mind raced with conflicting emotions. He felt betrayed by the deception, heartbroken for his grandmother's pain, and confused about his own place in the world. The other guards around him stood with unwavering confidence, but William felt like he was drowning in uncertainty. Queen Camilla took her position in the viewing area, surrounded by palace officials and security personnel. She watched as the guards prepared for the ceremony, noting the perfect synchronization of their movements. Her own thoughts drifted to the challenges she had faced in finding her place within the royal family, the years of scrutiny and criticism she had endured before being accepted by the public. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in just a few minutes. Captain Morrison gave his final commands, and the guards moved into their opening positions. The crowd fell silent in anticipation of the pageantry they were about to witness. Cameras were raised, children were lifted for better views, and everyone held their breath for the first notes of the military band. William tried to focus on his training, on the countless hours he had spent perfecting every movement, every turn, every salute. But his grandmother's words echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. How could he participate in a ceremony celebrating honor and tradition when his own family's honor was built on a lie? How could he salute the Queen when he no longer knew who he really was? The band struck up the first notes of the ceremonial march, and the changing of the guard officially began. The tourists cheered and applauded as the guards began their precise movements across the courtyard. Each step was calculated, each turn executed with mathematical precision. The ceremony that had captivated audiences for generations was unfolding once again. Queen Camilla watched with appreciation as the guards performed their intricate drill. She had always been moved by these displays of military precision and tradition. The dedication these young men showed to their duty reminded her of the best qualities of service and sacrifice that defined the monarchy itself. As the ceremony progressed, the moment approached when each guard would pass before the Queen Consort and render a formal salute. This was one of the most significant moments of the entire event, a gesture of respect and loyalty that connected the present moment to centuries of British tradition. One by one, the guards marched past Queen Camilla, each one snapping to attention and delivering a perfect salute as they passed. The crowd watched in respectful silence, understanding the solemnity of the moment. These were not merely ceremonial gestures but expressions of genuine respect and duty. William's turn was approaching rapidly. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to reconcile his personal crisis with his professional obligations. Every instinct told him to perform his duty as he had been trained, but something deeper, a fundamental question about the nature of honor itself, held him back. As he drew closer to Queen Camilla's position, William could see her face clearly. She looked regal and dignified, but there was also a warmth in her expression that he hadn't expected. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he saw not just the Queen Consort but a human being who had undoubtedly faced her own moments of doubt and struggle. The critical moment arrived. William stood directly in front of Queen Camilla, with hundreds of spectators watching and dozens of cameras recording. According to protocol, military tradition, and simple respect, he should have snapped to attention and delivered a crisp salute. The entire ceremony depended on this moment of mutual recognition between the crown and its protectors. But William's hand remained at his side. The salute that should have been automatic, instinctive, and immediate simply did not come. He stood perfectly still, looking directly at the Queen Consort, but his right hand never moved toward his forehead. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. The crowd, initially confused by the deviation from expected protocol, began to murmur among themselves. Some wondered if the young guard was having a medical episode, while others speculated about a possible security threat. Queen Camilla's own reaction was one of surprise rather than offense. Her years in the public eye had taught her to handle unexpected situations with grace and composure. Rather than showing anger or demanding an explanation, she simply nodded slightly and maintained her dignified bearing. Captain Morrison, however, was mortified. This breach of protocol was unprecedented in his 15 years of service. He could see the cameras capturing every second of the incident, knowing that by evening, this moment would be broadcast around the world. His first instinct was to immediately intervene and restore order to the ceremony. William himself seemed almost surprised by his own inaction. The internal struggle that had been building since his grandmother's revelation had reached a breaking point at the worst possible moment. He stood frozen between his training and his conscience, unable to move forward or backward. The other guards, despite their years of discipline, couldn't help but notice their colleagues' failure to follow protocol. Some exchanged quick glances, while others remained focused straight ahead, unsure of how to react to this unprecedented situation. After what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, William finally moved. But, instead of the expected salute, he simply nodded respectfully to Queen Camilla and continued with the rest of the ceremony. His face showed no defiance or disrespect, only a deep sadness that those close enough could clearly see. The remainder of the changing of the guard proceeded without further incident, but the damage was done. The crowd buzzed with speculation and confusion. Phones were already uploading videos to social media, and news outlets were being alerted to the unusual event at Windsor Castle. Queen Camilla maintained her composure throughout the rest of the ceremony, but, privately, she found herself deeply curious about what could have motivated such an unprecedented breach of protocol. There had been something in the young guard's eyes, not rebellion or disrespect, but genuine pain and conflict. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Captain Morrison knew he would need to address the situation immediately. An investigation would be required, disciplinary action might be necessary, and explanations would certainly be demanded by his superiors. William returned to the barracks with his fellow guards, dreading the conversation he knew was coming. He had acted on pure instinct in that crucial moment, but now he would have to explain his actions and face the consequences. His military career, which had meant everything to him just 24 hours earlier, now hung in the balance. The story of the guard who declined to salute Queen Camilla would spread rapidly across news channels and social media platforms. But the real story, the human drama of family secrets, personal crisis, and the search for authentic honor, would take much longer to unfold. As Queen Camilla returned to her royal duties that afternoon, she couldn't shake the image of the young guard's troubled expression. Something told her that this incident was about much more than a simple breach of protocol, and her compassionate nature made her hope that whatever was troubling the young man could eventually be resolved. The sun was setting over Windsor Castle as William sat alone in his quarters, staring at a photograph of his grandmother. Tomorrow would bring difficult questions and uncertain consequences, but tonight, he was simply a young man trying to understand who he really was and what honor truly meant in a world where the foundations of truth could shift without warning. The news broke faster than anyone could have anticipated. By 6 o'clock that evening, footage of Private William Hayes failing to salute Queen Camilla was trending across every major social media platform. The video, captured by dozens of tourists and amplified by news outlets worldwide, showed the moment of silence that lasted mere seconds but felt like an eternity to those who witnessed it. Captain Morrison sat in his office at Wellington Barracks, fielding phone calls from his superiors and trying to manage what had quickly become an international incident. The phone rang constantly, reporters seeking statements, military officials demanding explanations, and protocol experts analyzing every frame of the available footage. The captain's normally organized desk was covered with incident reports, media requests, and urgent messages from Buckingham Palace. "Sir," Sergeant Thompson knocked on the door before entering. "Private Hayes is here for his interview." Morrison looked up from his paperwork, his expression grave. In his 15 years of service, he had never faced a situation quite like this. Military discipline was built on respect, order, and tradition, all values that had been publicly called into question by Hayes's actions. Yet something about the young man's demeanor during the incident suggested this wasn't a case of simple insubordination. William entered the office and stood at attention, his dress uniform immaculate despite the turmoil of the day. His face showed the strain of the past 24 hours, but his posture remained straight and his expression respectful. "Private Hayes," Captain Morrison began, his voice carefully controlled, "I need you to explain exactly what happened during this morning's ceremony." William had rehearsed this moment in his mind hundreds of times since returning to the barracks. He knew that his military career hung in the balance, but he also knew that he owed his commanding officer, and himself, complete honesty about what had transpired. "Sir, I received disturbing news about my family the night before the ceremony," William began, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "Information that challenged everything I believed about my own background and my reasons for serving in the Guards." Morrison leaned back in his chair, sensing that this explanation would be more complex than he had initially expected. "Continue, Private." William took a deep breath and began to share the story his grandmother had told him about his grandfather's disgrace. As he spoke, Morrison found himself drawn into the human drama that lay beneath what the media was portraying as a simple breach of protocol. This wasn't about disrespect for the crown, it was about a young man grappling with a fundamental crisis of identity and purpose. When the moment came to salute Her Majesty, William continued, I found myself unable to perform what felt like a hollow gesture. If my own understanding of family honor was based on deception, how could I authentically represent the honor of this regiment? Morrison studied the young soldier's face carefully. He saw pain, confusion, and genuine struggle, but no trace of the arrogance or disrespect that he might have expected from someone who had deliberately snubbed the Queen Consort. Private Hayes, Morrison said finally, while I can understand your personal struggle, you must realize that your actions this morning have created a significant incident. The integrity of this regiment and the respect due to Her Majesty cannot be compromised by individual crises, regardless of their personal significance. William nodded, accepting the validity of his captain's position while still wrestling with the conflict between duty and authenticity that had led to his actions. Meanwhile, across London at Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla was in her private study, reviewing the day's events with her personal secretary, Sarah Mitchell. The incident at Windsor had generated an unprecedented level of media attention, and the palace was struggling to formulate an appropriate response. Ma'am, Sarah said, consulting her tablet, we've received over 200 media inquiries about this morning's incident. The palace press office is requesting guidance on how to respond. Camilla gazed out the window at the gardens, her mind still focused on the young guard's expression during that crucial moment. She had seen pain in his eyes, not defiance, and her instincts told her there was much more to this story than met the eye. What do we know about the guard himself? She asked. Sarah consulted her notes. Private William Hayes, 23 years old, exemplary service record, no previous disciplinary issues. By all accounts, he's been a model soldier since joining the Guards 2 years ago. This information only deepened Camilla's curiosity. A model soldier with no history of problems didn't suddenly decide to disrespect the crown without serious cause. Her years of experience with public service had taught her to look beyond surface appearances and consider the human stories that often lay hidden beneath dramatic headlines. I'd like to understand what motivated his actions, Camilla said thoughtfully. This doesn't feel like simple disrespect or rebellion. There's something deeper happening here. Sarah looked surprised by the Queen Consort's response. Protocol would typically demand swift disciplinary action and a formal statement condemning any breach of respect toward the royal family. Camilla's interest in understanding rather than simply punishing was characteristic of her compassionate approach but unusual in such a public situation. Back at Wellington Barracks, William's interview had concluded, and he now faced an uncertain wait while his superiors decided his fate. He returned to his quarters to find his roommate, Private David Chen, waiting with obvious concern. The whole base is talking about what happened, David said. Are you all right, mate? This isn't like you at all. William appreciated his friend's concern but found it difficult to explain the complex emotions that had led to his actions. How could he describe the feeling of discovering that his entire sense of identity was built on a foundation of lies? How could he explain the impossibility of performing a gesture of honor when honor itself had become an uncertain concept? I received some difficult news about my family, William said simply. It made me question everything I thought I knew about myself and my service here. David had known William for 2 years and had never seen his friend in such obvious distress. The William he knew was confident, dedicated, and deeply proud of his service with the Guards. This troubled young man seemed like a different person entirely. Whatever it is, you'll work through it, David offered. You're one of the best soldiers in the regiment. Everyone knows that. But William wasn't sure anymore. The certainty that had once guided his every action had been shattered by his grandmother's revelation. The pride he had felt in his uniform now felt complicated and uncertain. Even his friend's reassurance seemed to come from a world where truth and honor were simple concepts rather than complex philosophical questions. As evening approached, the story continued to gain momentum in the media. News anchors debated the significance of the incident, royal experts analyzed the implications for monarchy and military relations, and social media users offered opinions ranging from outrage to sympathy. Dr. Margaret Phillips, a historian specializing in royal protocol at Oxford University, appeared on the BBC Evening News to provide context for the unprecedented event. In over 300 years of ceremonial changing of the guard, she explained, there is no recorded instance of a guard failing to salute a member of the royal family. This represents a significant break from tradition and protocol. The interviewer pressed for her interpretation of the guard's motivations. What could possibly justify such a breach of military discipline and royal respect? Dr. Phillips chose her words carefully. Without knowing the specific circumstances, it's difficult to judge. However, history shows us that when good soldiers act in unexpected ways, there are usually compelling personal reasons that we don't immediately understand. Her measured response stood in contrast to some of the more inflammatory commentary appearing across various media outlets. Some commentators called for immediate dismissal and possible criminal charges, while others urged patience and understanding until more facts became available. In his hospital room across London, William's grandfather figure, or the man he had thought was his grandfather, lay unconscious, unaware of the controversy his long-kept secret had unleashed. Mary Hayes sat beside his bed, consumed by guilt over the timing of her revelation and its unintended consequences. She had intended to provide William with truth and closure, believing that honesty was always preferable to deception. Now she wondered if her decision to finally share the family secret had destroyed her beloved grandson's career and reputation. The burden of keeping the secret for 60 years had been heavy, but the weight of its revelation seemed even more crushing. A gentle knock on the hospital room door interrupted her troubled thoughts. A nurse entered with a sympathetic smile and the evening newspapers. "Mrs. Hayes, I thought you should know that your grandson is in the news," the nurse said gently. "Perhaps you'd rather hear about it from family?" Mary's heart sank as she saw the headlines splashed across the front pages. The story had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined. Her personal family revelation had become an international incident, and William was at the center of a media storm that could destroy his future. Back at Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla continued to review the situation with her advisors. The standard response would be to issue a statement expressing disappointment in the breach of protocol and confidence that military authorities would handle the matter appropriately. But Camilla found herself reluctant to close the door on understanding what had really happened. "I'd like to understand this young man's story before we respond publicly," she told her team. "Sometimes the most important thing is not what appears to happen, but why it happens." Her chief of staff, Robert Harrison, looked concerned. "Ma'am, with respect, the media pressure for a response is intense. Delay could be interpreted as uncertainty or weakness." Camilla considered this carefully. She understood the political implications, but her instincts told her that this situation required more than a standard protocol response. The pain she had seen in the young guard's eyes suggested a human story that deserved consideration before judgment. "Give me 24 hours, she decided. "I want to understand the full situation before we respond." As night fell over London, William lay awake in his narrow military cot, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the dramatic turn his life had taken in just 2 days. The certainty and purpose that had defined his military service seemed like distant memories, replaced by questions about identity, truth, and the nature of honor itself. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters and messages from friends and family who had seen the news. He had stopped answering after the first few calls, overwhelmed by the need to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. The photo of his grandmother remained on his bedside table, but now it seemed to mock rather than comfort him. The woman who had been his moral compass throughout his life had also been the keeper of a secret that undermined everything she had taught him about honesty and honor. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more questions, and probably the end of his military career. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the barracks, William Hayes was simply a young man trying to figure out who he really was and what he truly believed about duty, honor, and the complex nature of human truth. The story that had begun with a moment of hesitation in front of Queen Camilla was rapidly evolving into something much larger, an examination of the relationships between personal truth and public duty, between individual conscience and institutional loyalty, and between the weight of family secrets and the demands of honor in the modern world. The morning brought no relief from the media storm that had engulfed Private William Hayes and the British military establishment. Newspaper headlines screamed variations of guard snubs Queen and protocol breach rocks palace, while television news programs dissected every second of the now famous footage frame by frame. William woke before dawn, as had become his habit during military service, but, instead of the usual sense of purpose that accompanied his morning routine, he felt only dread. Today would bring the formal disciplinary hearing that would likely end his military career and, possibly result in criminal charges for breach of duty. As he prepared his dress uniform with the same meticulous attention to detail he had always maintained, William found himself questioning every aspect of his identity. The uniform that had once filled him with pride now felt like a costume for a role he no longer understood how to play. Captain Morrison had spent most of the night reviewing military law and precedent, trying to find guidance for a situation that had no clear parallel in British military history. The formal charges would be severe: failure to follow direct orders, breach of military protocol, and conduct unbecoming a soldier. Any one of these charges could result in dismissal from service and permanent damage to William's future prospects. But Morrison was troubled by his growing understanding of William's personal crisis. The young soldier's explanation about his family revelation had been compelling and authentic. Morrison himself was a third-generation military officer, and he understood how deeply family military tradition could shape a young person's sense of identity and purpose. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla had made an unprecedented decision. Despite the objections of her advisors and the protocols that typically govern royal responses to such incidents, she had requested a private meeting with Private Hayes before any formal disciplinary action was taken. "Ma'am," her chief of staff Robert Harrison protested, "this is highly irregular. The military chain of command exists for a reason, and royal intervention in disciplinary matters could set a dangerous precedent." Camilla understood his concerns, but her instincts told her that this situation required a human response rather than a purely institutional one. "Robert, in my years of public service, I've learned that sometimes the most important thing is to understand why something happens before deciding how to respond to what happened." The unprecedented nature of the Queen Consort's request sent ripples through both Buckingham Palace and the military hierarchy. Protocol officers scrambled to find precedent for such a meeting, while lawyers debated the implications for military discipline and royal authority. William received word of the Queen's request through Captain Morrison, who delivered the news with barely concealed amazement. "Private Hayes, Her Majesty Queen Camilla has requested a private audience with you this afternoon. This is unprecedented." William's first reaction was panic. The thought of facing Queen Camilla again, after his public failure to show proper respect, seemed almost unbearable. "Sir, I don't understand why Her Majesty would want to see me." "Neither do I, Private," Morrison admitted. "But, when the Queen Consort requests an audience, we comply. You'll be transported to Buckingham Palace at 1400 hours. As word of the meeting spread through unofficial channels, speculation reached new heights. Media outlets struggled to understand what could motivate the Queen Consort to personally intervene in what should have been a straightforward disciplinary matter. Dr. Margaret Phillips, the royal historian who had provided measured commentary the previous evening, was again called upon to offer perspective. "This is genuinely unprecedented," she told reporters. "The royal family typically maintains strict separation from military disciplinary procedures. Queen Camilla's decision to personally involve herself suggests she believes there are circumstances we haven't yet understood." At the hospital where Mary Hayes maintained her vigil beside her husband's bed, the elderly woman wrestled with overwhelming guilt. The morning newspapers lay unread beside her chair. She couldn't bear to see the headlines that painted her beloved grandson as a disrespectful soldier who had insulted the crown. Dr. Sarah Williams, the family's physician, had noticed Mary's distress during morning rounds. "Mrs. Hayes, you seem very troubled today. Is there anything I can do to help?" Mary looked up with tears in her eyes. "Doctor, I'm afraid I've ruined my grandson's life by telling him a family secret I've kept for 60 years. He's a good boy, but now the whole world thinks he's disrespectful and ungrateful." Dr. Williams sat down beside Mary's chair, recognizing that her patient was carrying a burden far heavier than her husband's illness. Sometimes the most difficult truths are also the most important ones to share. Perhaps your grandson needed to know this information, even if the timing was unfortunate. But Mary wasn't convinced. She had spent decades protecting her family from the shame of her husband's military disgrace, only to see that protection ultimately harmed the very person she was trying to shield. At Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla spent her morning reviewing everything that was known about Private Hayes and his family background. Her staff had compiled a comprehensive file that painted a picture of a young man from a working-class background who had found purpose and direction through military service. The file revealed that William had been an excellent student despite coming from a broken home, that he had turned down university scholarships to enlist in the Guards, and that his service record was exemplary in every respect. This was not the profile of someone who would casually disrespect authority or tradition. Sarah Mitchell, her personal secretary, had also uncovered information about William's family history. "Ma'am, it appears that Private Hayes's grandfather served in World War II, though the specific details of his service are unclear in the official records." Camilla sensed there was more to this story. What kind of unclear details? The records show that he was discharged from service in 1943, but the circumstances aren't specified. There's a notation that suggests the case was reviewed by military tribunal, but the details remain classified even after all these years. This information deepened Camilla's conviction that William's actions had roots in family history that might explain, if not excuse, his breach of protocol. She had lived long enough to understand that family secrets had a way of shaping behavior across generations, often in unexpected ways. The afternoon arrived with unprecedented security measures surrounding Buckingham Palace. Media outlets had positioned cameras at every possible angle, hoping to capture images of Private Hayes arriving for his mysterious audience with the Queen Consort. William traveled to the palace in an official military vehicle, accompanied by Captain Morrison and a military escort that was as much for his protection as for protocol. The sight of crowds of photographers and journalists outside the palace gates made him realize how far beyond his personal crisis this incident had grown. Inside the palace, Queen Camilla waited in her private study rather than one of the formal reception rooms typically used for official meetings. She had deliberately chosen this more intimate setting to encourage honest conversation rather than formal protocol. When William was announced and escorted into the study, Camilla was struck again by the pain she saw in his young face. He stood at rigid attention, his military training overriding his personal turmoil, but she could see the emotional strain he was carrying. "Private Hayes," she began gently, "please, sit down. I asked to see you because I sensed yesterday that your actions came from personal struggle rather than disrespect." William remained standing, uncertain of the protocol for such an unprecedented situation. "Your Majesty, I deeply regret any offense my actions may have caused. There is no excuse for failing to show proper respect." Camilla studied his face carefully. "William, may I call you William? I've lived long enough to recognize the difference between disrespect and distress. What you showed yesterday was clearly the latter. I'd like to understand what troubled you so deeply." For a moment, William's military composure wavered. The Queen Consort's unexpected kindness and genuine concern were the last things he had expected after his public failure. He found himself faced with a choice between maintaining formal distance and sharing the human truth that had led to his actions. "Your Majesty," he began hesitantly, "I learned something about my family that challenged everything I believed about honor and service. I joined the Guards because I wanted to honor my grandfather's military legacy, but I discovered that legacy was built on deception." Camilla leaned forward with interest. "Tell me about your grandfather, William." Slowly, haltingly, William began to share the story his grandmother had revealed. As he spoke about learning of his grandfather's disgrace, his sense of betrayal and confusion, and his inability to perform what felt like a hollow gesture of honor, Camilla found herself deeply moved by the young man's struggle. "So when the moment came to salute," William concluded, "I couldn't reconcile performing a gesture of honor when I no longer understood what honor meant in my own family." Camilla sat quietly for a moment, processing what she had heard. This was indeed a story of personal crisis rather than institutional disrespect. The young man before her had been wrestling with fundamental questions about identity, truth, and the nature of honor itself. "William," she said finally, "do you believe that your grandfather's mistake, made under the pressures of war 60 years ago, defines the honor of your service today?" The question caught William off guard. He had been so focused on the deception and disgrace that he hadn't considered whether past failures necessarily determined present worth. "I'm not sure, Your Majesty. Everything I thought I knew about my family's honor was false." Camilla smiled sadly. "My dear young man, I've learned something important during my years in public life. The measure of honor isn't the absence of mistakes or failures, it's how we respond to truth when we discover it, and how we choose to live authentically moving forward." She paused, looking out the window at the palace gardens where tourists and photographers still gathered. "Your grandfather made a mistake during one of the most terrifying periods in human history. That mistake doesn't erase your own service or diminish the honor you've shown in your 2 years with the guards." William felt something shift inside him as he processed her words. The shame and confusion that had dominated his thoughts for 2 days began to give way to a different perspective. "But, Your Majesty, I failed to show you proper respect. I let personal problems interfere with my duty." Camilla's expression became even more gentle. "William, you're human. You received devastating news about your family and struggled with how to reconcile that news with your sense of duty. That's not a failure of character, it's evidence of your humanity." For the first time since his grandmother's revelation, William felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps his world hadn't completely collapsed. The Queen Consort's understanding and compassion were helping him see his situation from a different angle. "What I saw in your eyes yesterday wasn't disrespect," Camilla continued. "It was the look of someone grappling with difficult truths about life and family. Those struggles don't disqualify you from service, they might actually make you a more thoughtful and compassionate leader." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Camilla sharing her own experiences of joining the royal family, facing public scrutiny, and learning to maintain personal authenticity while fulfilling public duties. William found himself opening up about his fears, his sense of lost identity, and his uncertainty about his future. As their meeting concluded, Camilla made a decision that would surprise her staff and the public even more than her initial request for the meeting. "William, I'm going to make a request of the military authorities. I don't believe you should face disciplinary action for yesterday's incident. Instead, I'd like to recommend that you receive counseling support to help you work through these family revelations and their impact on your sense of identity." William looked stunned. "Your Majesty, I couldn't accept such intervention on my behalf." "You're not accepting anything," Camilla replied firmly. "I'm exercising my judgment about what serves the best interests of both the crown and a young man who has shown exemplary service under normal circumstances."